Welcome back to the third webinar of the Nordic EVS Digital. I'm Christina Bu, Secretary General of the Norwegian Electric Vehicle Association.
And I'm Jan Moberg, the CEO and the Editor-in-Chief of TU Media. We're delighted to have so many of you joining us this afternoon. It's a very sunny Oslo, and I hope you're doing well as well.
Last time we took a closer look at the Nordic or the EV trends in the Nordic countries, where we also learned that more people are planning to buy an EV this year compared to last year, and that the greatest barriers in many of the Nordic countries is the price of the cars, except Norway, of course, where range is named as the topmost barrier.
That is indeed true and also highly relevant for today when we look at the discussion of EV policies at the EU level. The EU has set a goal to reduce the CO2 emissions from cars and vans with, from what I understand, 37.5% by 2030. And we are curious about how this target came about, and not the least what needs to be done by both the respective EU countries and also the car industry in order to reach this ambitious goal.
And with us today we have the very impressive Miriam Dalli. She's the Dr. Miriam Dalli. She's the member of the European Parliament. She spearheaded the legal framework initially from the Parliament, targeting 40% CO2 emission reduction from cars by 2030. She was also chosen to serve on the Committee of Inquiry into the emission measurements in the automotive sector after the Volkswagen emission scandal. She is the head of the Maltese Labour Party, and she's also vice president of the Socialist and Democrats group in the EU. She's definitely the best person to tell us how the legal framework came about, not to mention what EV policy to expect in the EU in the future.
I absolutely agree, and certainly look forward to hearing from her and to get the European car industry's view on EU's policy and the target to cut the emissions from cars and light vans. We have invited also Erik Mark Jutema. He is the director of the European Automobile Manufacturers Association, representing the majority of European car industry. It's also interesting, he was appointed general director last year, and before that worked with IBM, the information industry, as a global transportation leader, focusing on optimized transport solution for governments and smart cities.
Exactly, and after their presentations we will have a panel discussion with both of them, and we encourage all of you watching this to send us questions and directed at both Miriam and Erik Mark.
So Miriam, if you are ready, we look forward to get started and listening to you. The microphone is yours.
Thanks a lot. Good afternoon to both of you, and good afternoon to everyone who's following. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you my ideas on the future of mobility. I believe there has never been a more exciting time than now to discuss the developments that are happening, the innovation that is ensuing, but also the investments that are materializing. For me, this is not only about electromobility, it is about ecological mobility, it is about environmental sustainable mobility. And it frames within what we want our vision for the future to be. I'm saying this because the increasing reality of climate change that we are facing today necessitates a shift from traditional economic models to ones that are rooted in sustainability, where new technologies can flourish, where innovation takes center stage, and where further investments are channeled to research and development. And I'm framing my intervention today with the full acknowledgement that climate change is one of the major challenges that we are currently facing. But as it happens with every challenge, there will always be opportunities. And I believe that this is about the opportunity for countries to stay ahead of the curve, to attract the right investments, and also create quality jobs whilst ensuring that consumers have the best deal possible. Why I'm mentioning all these things? Because these were the things that we were balancing out when we negotiated the CO2 regulation for cars and vans. And allow me to bring also things into perspective on what we are living today, because COVID-19 is also an eye-opener in that it made it even more pressing to invest in the right direction and greening our economies. And transport has been identified over and over again as the largest source of Europe's climate problems due to its steady emission increases. Now, this is the time for smart mobility with car sharing, charging infrastructure, smart city planning, automation, smart sensing, and also autonomous vehicles, amongst others. Sufficient emission reductions through the deployment of zero and low emission technologies, however, needs to happen in the next years if we want to reach our climate targets. To have a successful transition to zero and low emission mobility requires a coherent policy framework that would cover vehicles, that would cover infrastructure, that would include alternative fuels infrastructure, electricity grids, employment, and also economic incentives. Now, to go to the regulation that I negotiated when it comes to the EU CO2 targets for cars and vans, and this is post-period 2020. As you might imagine, we had a series of intense meetings with member states and with the European Commission as well. I was representing the European Parliament until we agreed that new cars will need to emit 37.5% less CO2 from 2030 onwards, and new vans will have to emit 31% less CO2 from 2030 onwards. The legislation covers as well the period between 2025 and 2029, where both cars and vans will have to emit 15% less CO2. The new legislation also targets sales. So we have sales target for zero low emission vehicles of 15% for 2025 and of 35% for 2030. I'm sure you're aware it wasn't easy negotiations, because my main aim was to make sure that I get different stakeholders together. Everyone has different point of views, everyone had different interests, and to balance out and make sure that we have the right package. I'm glad that this legislation went far beyond what the Commission originally proposed, because the European Commission originally came up with a 30% CO2 reduction for 2030. But both us as Parliament and the Member States as well realized that that was a very low target in the current circumstances and also given the current technology. We want to make sure that the EU's automotive industry remains competitive, and we understand as well what is happening in other continents. We want to make sure that we reach a balance between environmental issues, between ensuring job protection, but also giving the best deal possible to our consumers. For us, air quality was extremely important, and we fought really hard also to include fuel consumption monitoring from 2030 to detect gaps between the real-world performance and also testing regimes. Now, in this legislation, there are multiple ways to reach new targets. So it's not only about electric cars, it's about solar vehicles, it's about plug-in hybrids, it's about hydrogen, it's about fuel cell technology. And at this point in time, it is also about efficient combustion engines, because what we want to make sure is that manufacturers as a whole have a fleet that as a whole reduces CO2 emissions by that percentage. And industry players from meetings I'm holding do understand that there are new technologies and those technologies can help us reach these targets. Now, we have already taken a big step forward in terms of technology, availability and infrastructure, and this is a trend that will undoubtedly accelerate over the years to come. And I believe that all this can help foster a culture and mentality shift towards cleaner modes of transport and also ensuring better air quality. Here are some of the benefits that the Commission quantified we would have with the current legislation. And this is the balance that I'm all the time speaking about, because it is estimated that once this legislation comes into place and if implemented properly, because that's the crux of the issue as well, we will be saving around 170 million tons of CO2 emissions, which would be reduced in between 2020 and 2030. We'll have better air quality, especially in our cities. There will be GDP increases of up to 6.8 billion euros in 2030, and this can create around 70,000 additional jobs. And on average, there will be consumer savings of up to 600 euros on a new car bought in 2025, and that would be over the vehicle's lifetime, and up to 1,500 euros for a new car bought in 2030. And consumers will see overall savings of up to 18 billion euros per year in fuel costs. So these figures, thanks to this legislation, can result into these savings, which deal with employment, which would deal with air quality, which deal with consumer benefits as well. That's why I'm saying my aim was to strike the right balance between all parties and achieve results that would allow us to reduce CO2 emissions, improve air quality and the health of our citizens, and allow consumers to access cheaper, clean mobility. Now, over the next decade, zero and low emission vehicles are also expected to reach price parity with internal combustion engine. And this addresses an issue that, Christina, you mentioned in the beginning, because yes, consumers are concerned about the price of a zero and a low emission vehicle. But studies show that price parity can be reached in 2025, and also that vehicles can also be cheaper in the longer term. And I would say that given the terms of the European Green Deal and also the climate law that we are currently discussing in Parliament right now, it is fair to say that zero emission vehicles will be a more popular choice within the next 10 years. Which brings me to consumer concerns, because we have still a long way to go, and there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. Because it's a fact, the current rate of zero emission vehicles adoption across the EU is quite slow. Now, car manufacturers say, at least this is what I heard in a number of meetings I had, that consumer demand is not high. When I speak to consumers, they insist that there are only a few zero emission vehicle options, and they are quite limited. In some cases, in some countries, it takes months from the moment you want to buy and order a zero low emission vehicle until actually that zero low emission vehicle arrives. The issue of price, zero emission vehicles are still expensive, and also we have an issue when it comes to proper infrastructure across the EU, which we are pushing for the EU to actually address. What I'm showing here is a study that was carried out by AlixPartners Analysis, which mentions that 48% for them the purchase price is a concern. The limited access to plug-in stations, another 48% are concerned with that, which brings us to the problem of infrastructure. Some are concerned because they think that the battery life is quite limited. Some, 47%, believe that there is limited range on single charge, and 38% for them is a concern, the lengthy charge time. So these are all issues that need to be addressed, which means that the EU needs to create a strong home market for these vehicles and invest in the necessary infrastructure to support this market. Moreover, price reduction is also heavily reliant on mass manufacturing, which in turn would require strict policy measures. So to achieve this, I believe in the European Union, we need to definitely invest so much more in research and also technology. So we need to foster battery manufacturing in Europe so that European industry would be able to tap into a global market of batteries that is forecasted to reach 250 billion euros per year by 2025. So there is an opportunity definitely there. And I believe we need to give space to new technologies. Just yesterday, I was in touch with a Dutch company. It's a startup. They are investing in solar vehicles with solar panels. It is an innovative technology that can eliminate, for example, the concern for charging, because it relies mainly on solar charging. So the ideas are there, the buzz is there, but we need to make sure that they have the space to work and that these ideas make it to mass market. What I saw following the regulation for CO2 emission targets for cars and vans, I believe has already led to a changing automotive industry that is more reliant on alternatively powered vehicles. Now, and this is where I would like also to raise a bit of an alarm bell, because there are some industry players who, for example, want to go back from this regulation. They want to go back and delete what we have achieved so far. And I've heard, for example, that they want to reduce the targets. For me, that is completely unacceptable, because I believe COVID-19 should not be used as an excuse by those people who always tried to reject a reduction in CO2 emissions. Instead, I believe that it should serve us as an impetus to make sure that we have the right incentives that can target investments in zero and low emission vehicles. Ultimately, this will help us keep jobs in Europe, it will help us reduce pollution and boost the competitiveness of our industries. I will stop here for the time being, and I look forward also to hear different perspectives and also engage in a discussion.
Thank you, Miriam. That was really interesting. And I have loads of questions for you, but we're going to wait a little bit. And while Eric Marcus is preparing his presentation, we will just have a small break with a video.
Urgent action is needed to solve the climate crisis, and electrification of the transport sector with renewables will reduce CO2 emissions considerably. EV policies are spreading around the world, with Norway taking the lead.
We are now at 10% fully electric cars in Norway. That's pretty amazing. Here in Oslo, it's close to 20%, so the electric cars are pretty visible.
Electric vehicles in Norway are easy to identify by their number plates, beginning with EL, EK and EV, giving them special access to high-occupancy vehicle lanes and reduced parking and toll fees.
Last year, more than 40% of new car sales in Norway were electric cars. But we're not pleased with that. Our goal is that by 2025, 100% of new car sales should be electric.
How do we get policymakers, business and consumers to speed up the transition?
Welcome to the Nordic EV Summit 2020, the most important conference on electric mobility in Europe. This year, the theme is Entering the Electric Era.
Visit nordicevs.no.
And now to Erik Mark Jurema. He is the General Director of the European Automobile Manufacturers Association. And Erik Mark, just how has this legal framework affected the car industry and your members? The screen is yours.
Thank you very much. And yeah, it's really good to be here. And thank you for giving me this opportunity. Let me start with who are our members, because we talk about our members, but it's good to see them on the screen. And as you can see, it's basically all European producers. It's a large group of very interesting companies who are responsible for about 14 million of people who work in the automotive sector. It's about 11.4% of all manufacturing jobs. And for the taxes in Europe, we generate 440 billion tax. On top of that, 84 billion trade surplus, 7% of EU GDP. And of course, our R&D spending, especially in the area of what we are doing in Europe, is leading the European innovation agenda. So with COVID-19, and Miriam said when she started the presentation, it's exciting times. It is certainly exciting. It's also very difficult, especially for us. We see we have huge question marks, of course, about the future. We saw a 76.3% decline of registrations in April, worst even in Italy and Spain. And March -50, April -76. Luckily, May is a little bit better, but still it is really bad. Also, we see, if we look at the European forecast, this is something we have never experienced before. recovery will be very slow, and we are forecasting a 25% drop in car sales for this year. Very difficult for our industry. We talk about a volume of cars lost of about 5 million. We talk about a volume of money of 150 billion euro. Of course, when you look at the good numbers that Mirjam presented, the GDP increase of the CO2 reduction will be 6.8 billion. That is, of course, very small compared to the 150 billion we just lost in the couple of months. Now, about our perspective on the future of transport and EV. Of course, our car industry fully supports climate neutrality by 2050. We support the numbers that were just mentioned by Mirjam. Electrification and hydrogen will be very dominant, and renewable fuels might play another role for the existing fleet. But of course, we don't have control there. What we have control is producing new cars. And I can tell you, I am driving an electric car since 2011 already. It was a Citroën C0. So I'm really sold on this. And I think most people are afraid of the thing they don't know, because I know that electric cars are great to drive and are very cost efficient and of course good for our environment. We also, looking backwards, we see a change. If you look at the numbers on the slide in 2015, 2016, you mainly saw a shift from diesel to petrol. But now the cars are available. If we look at the 136 different electronic cars that were already available in 2019, the car that I was driving since 2011 is even on that chart. But now, even this year, we are gaining 36 more models. So basically, you could say that there is more than enough choice. And we see a change happening. This year, in the first quarter, before, of course, the pandemic hit, we see a big increase of alternative fuel. Lots of people buy electric cars, and we see a big decrease in diesel and petrol. So I think we are really heading into the right direction. Of course, with the combination of COVID-19 and the changes our industry is going through, it is still challenging even more now with COVID-19. And we have to acknowledge that there is a big difference between the people who are buying a car in Italy and Spain compared to Norway. I think Norway is a great and exceptional example because also the benefits you give to the car owners. But what we now need is two things from Europe. It's political support, and I hope Mirjam can help me there, to make clean vehicles more affordable, using maybe the Norway example as well, and deploy the infrastructure. Let's go with fleet renewal. I think the real green start after COVID-19 will be green fleet renewal, purchase incentives needed for the families who want to buy a car, but they don't have enough money to buy it. And also keeping the 14 million jobs alive with the 40 million people depending on them. Support the families with cars, or the small heroes, the transport medium-sized enterprises, the small truck owners who cannot afford a modern clean vehicle due to, of course, the corona fallout. So we ask for EU-wide support for EV fleet renewal to boost the private and business demand, to support the economic recovery, to accelerate the greening of the vehicle fleet across the whole of Europe. On top of that, of course, we fully want to push the EV rollout. I know in Norway and probably in the Netherlands, there is a lot of good examples. but we don't see that example in the rest of Europe. We are happy with the 1 million public charging points that the EU recovery plan is talking about, but we need about 2.8, even probably 3 million car EV points. So we're only getting about 15 times. We need to get 15 times more than today, and also for trucks. And national governments should really help and step up the efforts now to give the consumers the confidence to buy electric vehicles and to be instrumental to achieve carbon neutrality. So my conclusion had to round up: the industry is delivering on electronic vehicles. We are delivering on CO2 targets. We now need fleet renewal schemes to stimulate the launch of the sector with green vehicles to replace the old CO2 emitting fleet with green vehicles. And of course, we need this urgency, and not only talk about it, but really do it. And unfortunately, we hear lots of words, but not a lot of action yet. And that is where we are hoping for. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Eric, Mark. Can we get them both on video, or is that not working? We'll see if we can get to see Eric as well. That was very interesting, and I'd like, there you are, perfect. I would like to start with a question from the Norwegian perspective, and obviously because we're here in Oslo. From 2021, phased in from 2020, the EU fleet-wide average emission target is 95 grams CO2 per kilometer. Would you to guess what the number is in Norway the first 4 months of this year?
I think I know it is well below that, probably around 50.
It's actually, if you look at the NEDC numbers, it's 45. So what is your comment on that? Is your goals a bit weak?
No, I think Norway is a great example. And we have to be honest, Norway is good, but let's look at Italy, let's look at Spain, let's look at Poland or the whole of Eastern Europe. The same numbers that you mentioned, we kind of feel also maybe in the Netherlands, where I come from. When you have the majority of cars being sold that are electric, then it's easy. But unfortunately, it's not the case, and we see a delay of purchasing new cars. That is a big problem, because now the people who were using public transport are buying a second-hand car, and in most cases these are young people who are always traveling with public transport. They now need to buy a car because they need it for their job, they need it to travel safe to their work, to do their work, and they unfortunately now choose a second-hand SUV in most cases, which probably is the dirtiest car you can buy. And we hope that the Euro Commission can help these consumers to make a decision for maybe a smaller, but at least a plug-in hybrid or electric car. And that is where we need a lot of help.
Miriam.
I have to be a bit critical on this point, because unfortunately, I think that for a very long time, the EU was hostage, for use of a better word, of an industry that invested so much in diesel technology. And I'm not saying it is the automotive industry's fault, because we had a long time where investments were going in that direction, but that, from my perspective, was keeping certain companies from actually investing in newer technologies that are currently needed. So we had an issue where electric vehicle models being rolled out were very, very slow in the amount of models we saw. Now we're seeing a change in that, and I'm seeing much more EVs coming out. I have to also say thanks to Eric Mark for this presentation by ACEA. It's totally different than when I was discussing this regulation. I have to say that, because ACEA at that point in time didn't even want a target for 2025. and they wanted a very, very, very minimal target for 2030. And that is not the way forward on how you actually make sure that you keep a competitive advantage and invest in newer technologies. I'm a firm believer of policy pushing change. Sometimes it's good to leave markets to carry out the change, but we need also policy direction, because when you have policy direction, then you start seeing change as well. But it's good to also see the association now saying that, yes, that change can happen and that technology is there. And I saw that stark difference also when I held meetings at the beginning of this year with some workers and worker representatives of different automotive companies. Whilst they were a bit hesitant with the new CO2 standards for 2025 and 2030. Now they were comfortable with those standards because they understood that technology is there. And if you have enough lead time for companies to prepare, then yes, companies can also start preparing.
A question to both of you. Very interesting presentations, but how much is this a battle between continents? I mean, are we afraid that the Chinese are going to take it all from the market? And I guess that should be a concern also for you as politicians, Miriam.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, in my introduction, I made a reference to being competitive as a continent, because I acknowledge that we have a very strong automotive industry in the EU. I don't want that automotive industry to get weaker. I want us to make sure that we remain competitive when compared to other continents. But to remain competitive, it means that you need to start investing in new technology. You can't get stuck with older technology and then you see other continents progressing, because then we would be too late in the game. And that's what I didn't want. And when I was negotiating this piece of legislation, I was seeing what's happening in China particularly, how they were advancing not only on EVs, but also in battery production. I want us to have an open discussion on how we can make sure that we get that battery production here in the European Union and how we can make our automotive industry stronger. And I believe this is one way how we can achieve that.
Yes, absolutely, and I've also find the sort of shift in ASEA's. I think maybe that's partly due to you, Eric, but obviously also how the whole world is changing and money talks, and I think it's good that China started pressuring Europe, and it's fun to see that last year actually more was invested in Europe than in China. We were a bit late maybe, but now it's happening, and we're even discussing battery factories here in Norway. There are plans, so that's really good. And when it comes to CO2 emissions, I just wanted to tell you a really good news that we got a few days ago here in Norway. We have pretty ambitious targets when it comes to reducing CO2 emissions in Norway for 2020 already. And a lot of the politicians last year said that we probably won't be able to reach those targets. Last week, however, we saw the new numbers from 2019 that the CO2 emissions in Norway was down 3.4% from the year before. And that is to a large degree due to the amount of electric cars that we have on the road. So we're starting to really see the effect in Norway, and we most probably will reach our 2020 targets. So I just want to say that I think that for EVs, it will take some time before we really see the results when we look at CO2 emissions, but they will get there, and the sooner we shift our vehicle fleet, the faster. So I just thought I'd follow up with a question, Miriam, about your introduction, because it's really interesting how this is happening and has happened, the negotiations and all the different view from the Commission and the Parliament. What was the most difficult getting this deal signed in the end?
It was an exciting negotiations, because you had different member states with different interests, some that have a very strong automotive industry back home, others that don't have a strong automotive industry at home. And my role was to try and balance out all the different points of views and all the different aspects. It wasn't easy at all. At one point, I had to walk out of the negotiations because the council presidency at that point in time didn't move and didn't want to move from their position, and it was my job to try and push further. Obviously, we know that the Commission position was even weaker than the Council position, than the governments in the member states, which is not always the case, or which is not usually the case. So that put even more pressure on us as Parliament to even perform more. But the best thing that I could always rely on were the scientific studies that I was always referring to. Because at no point I wanted to just come up with a figure out of nowhere. Every time I mentioned a figure, it was always based with scientific evidence and with scientific studies. And I think that was the thing that then made us convince also to go for more stringent targets.
Well, you certainly succeeded. It seems like a turning point in European politics. But I have a question to both of you. How is the relation with the energy companies? Because you can't touch these topics without going further down the value chain.
Yeah. No, we work closely with the energy companies and the European Association, Eurelectric. We just did a plea end of last year together with the European NGO Transport and Environment, together with an energy company and with Eurelectric and ACEA, saying we work together on the future of electromobility. And one remark I wanted to make, you mentioned that earlier, I think ACEA has made the change, and it's not me only. Of course, it is the CEOs that hired me that made the change. Because if you hire a director general that drives an electric car, you must be convinced. And that is the same, I have to say right now, even under these difficult circumstances, our CEOs are not asking for CO2 relief. And I think that's it's difficult for them, but it's a very big gesture to the European Parliament, to the Commission, but also to the world of the future, our children, our grandchildren who want to see a clean future and clean cars driving around. They want transport, but it has to be clean.
I'm glad that you mentioned the energy sector because obviously when we speak about energy, it's not only about electricity. You have also stakeholders that are in the fuel industry that were also part of the stakeholders and part of the considerations when negotiations were undergoing as well. But it's interesting because if you had to look at the current EU energy mix, emissions from electric vehicles, for example, would be 30% lower than emissions from conventional petrol and diesel cars. And that is just one figure. Eric Mark mentioned Eurelectric. Eurelectric, in one of its studies, mentions also that the EU's power production could be carbon-free by 2045. So I would say that this drive to reduce CO2 emissions from the automotive industry fits in also with the drive of actually making sure that we will have a decarbonized economy by 2050, because ultimately that's where the European Union wants to go, and that's what we want to achieve.
Another question for both of you. We have the pandemic. As we've seen from your presentation, Eric Mark, it's hurting your industry. Now, wouldn't there be an opportunity for both the legislative side and the manufacturer side to get some incentives going, lower price on new energy vehicles to spur sales in the second half of this year?
Yes, certainly. We need that right now. And I think the first plans are already announced. It is very good to see that Germany and France and Spain have announced very good fleet renewal schemes, which are focusing on clean energy vehicles, on electric vehicles, but also in trading in and scrapping old diesel cars. So I think now it's time to work together. And I love to work together with the teams across the table, which are TNE, but also with the members from Parliament, our Dutch MEP Bas Eickhout, but also with Miriam. I hope that as soon as we can be back in the office in Brussels, that we can meet and let's make the plans together.
I definitely agree as a legislator that we need to push investments in the right direction. Like it or not, post-COVID-19, investments have to be done, and they have to be done across the EU and in the different member states. Now it is up to policymakers to see where they are going to channel those investments. And I'm a big advocate, also because I am within the Social and Democrats responsible of the European Green Deal, to make sure that we channel that money, that investments, in greening our economies. And that would mean also that we need to make sure that we have cleaner transport across the board. So definitely, I, together with like-minded colleagues in the European Parliament, will be pushing hard to make sure that investments go in that direction.
Perfect. We need to ask some questions from the audience as well, although I would like to, I have much more on my own, but maybe we could spend a little more, I don't know if you're very busy, maybe we can spend 5 more minutes more for questions. Sure. That would be great. Sure. Okay, so one question here. Given the vehicle sales are well down in all EU nations, is it likely that the ACEA will want to motivate sales in the second semester of 2020, bringing EV prices down?
Yeah, we would really support that. I think it's needed, not only EV. I think it's needed for the whole industry. The jobs, the 14 million jobs I was mentioning, are there to produce cars that are much cleaner than ever before. And I think it's very good with subsidies and with grants and with scrapping schemes to lower the price of electric vehicles, with lower taxes. I think Norway is an excellent example. Unfortunately, not a lot of countries are following that example. The electric cars in itself are more expensive to make. And therefore, I think there is a reason why the price is higher. But that could really be compensated with attractive taxes, the things like you do in Norway with possibility to drive the car on the bus lanes, etc., no toll. Things like that are really helping us to produce as many cars as the European citizens like.
I have to say one thing, Eric, Mark, and you know what Norway really is doing is taxing the purchase of petrol and diesel engine cars pretty heavily. I'm sure you're not asking for that, but that is really what Norway has done, which has spurred the sales of EVs, and EVs are not taxed, obviously. We have another question, and this is directed at you, Miriam. How do you explain the 70,000 additional jobs with a steep increase in EV registrations, given that the EVs are simpler to assembly and easier to maintain and repair?
Because that amount, which was quoted by a study of the European Commission that took into account not simply the jobs that are related to the car industry alone, but also the other jobs that would ensue. Because what we are speaking about is an industry that will have also ripple effect in other areas. So if we, for example, need to have more charging infrastructure, then we need those workers that will produce that charging infrastructure, will install the charging infrastructure. If we are speaking about maintenance, if we are speaking about plug-in hybrids, because let's also understand that when we are speaking about a CO2 reduction, we are speaking about a mix, a fleet mix by the manufacturers that will include not only electric vehicles, but will include also plug-in hybrids. And we know that a plug-in hybrid requires much more than just assembling parts or as simple as an electric vehicle. So this takes into account all the value chain, so to say, that would be required with such a transition.
Yeah, maybe one addition from my side, if I may.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with the 70,000 jobs. Also through automation, the car industry will generate jobs. But we also have to be clear that with losing the combustion engine, we lose a lot of loss of jobs too. If you're now currently a small factory in the Nordics producing spark plugs, you will probably have a hard time in the future, or gear shifts. And we estimated that we will lose about 330,000 jobs, and we will gain about 70,000 jobs. So the net effect will be a loss, about 250,000 of jobs. But I think it's a sacrifice that is very tough, but we probably need to make it for the future. And what we hope to be is the exporting nation where the best cars in the world are made, like now, but then the best electric cars in the world. And then with that growth in export, we can recover the job loss we see on the short term.
But let's understand as well that this will not be a change that will happen 100% in just a couple of years. So there is a longer span of time where you would need also to have reskilling and upskilling of workers, and also making sure that new workers get into the market with the required skills. Let's understand as well that we have car manufacturers that want to diversify. So I've spoken with car manufacturers that are looking into also expanding into the battery sector. And that would mean that they will require new workers, even though with different skills than they currently have.
Well, first of all, when you move from a product that contains 2,000 moving parts down to something that contains 100 moving parts, of course, something's going to be lost on the way. But it is also a fantastic opportunity for the car manufacturers to be efficient and make money. But I have to ask you, Miriam, with this success, both in politics and environment, and hopefully also for business, what's next on your agenda? And Erik Mark, how will you respond to her next move, next moves?
So I'm particularly interested to wait for a proposal by the Commission about batteries in Europe. We're waiting for that because I believe that would be part of the whole chain if we want to make the transition to cleaner mobility. And I'm also looking out now for the CO2 review, because we will have a review and I will be looking out also for that. And I want to make sure, and I will be following that closely, that COVID-19 will not be used as a justification to weaken down these standards that we agreed upon in 2018.
Erik Mark?
Yeah, my response is, of course, we know what is coming, and we are currently, of course, preparing for what is coming. Our R&D teams are really working on that. But the battery production in Europe, I think, is very good, but we also should be careful because producing a battery is probably done in a lights-out factory. It's more the industry around the battery, the packaging of the cells, the innovation and the automation around the automotive industry that will help to create the industry for the future. It's autonomous cars, it's artificial intelligence in the car, it is the data economy around the car that will be the future. And that is where our members are now really investing. And of course, we are preparing for what Miriam said, the CO2 regulations that become stricter and stricter over time. But that is a given. We want to be the most modern and most innovative sector in the world. And of course, the cars are already premium if they come from Europe, and they need to stay premium.
Very good.
Great.
Christina, you have another question from audience?
Yes, there are lots of questions from the audience. We will never be able to go through all of them. But I also wanted to ask you one question about plug-in hybrids. We have a few more minutes, but okay, I'll do the plug-in hybrid question first. We see in Norway a lot of new plug-in hybrids entering the market, and the sales this year is actually up 30%, while the BEV or full electric sales are down 20%. This is of course partly due to COVID-19. But is there really a need for this transition with plug-in hybrids when standard zero emission cars, the range is 400 kilometers going forward?
Yeah, I would say so. The reason, for example, I now live in Brussels. I was living in Amsterdam, and in Amsterdam we were spoiled just like you in Norway maybe. So I could drive an electric car. Now I'm in Brussels. There's no public charging. Basically, there are probably maybe 10 or 20 charging posts in the whole of Brussels. Last year, they wanted to put 500 new, and they only put 17. So this will take 50 years to get to the right number there. So you need plug-in hybrids for the longer distance, and you probably need plug-in hybrids for the cities that are not as serious as the cities in Norway, the Netherlands, for that. I think it's a good combination. The modern plug-in hybrid has a range of about 100 kilometers, electric, fully electric, and will automatically change to electric into a city. It's automatically geo-fenced. It will go electric in a city. And if you then drive outside in the countryside and you have a small amount of emission from a very efficient petrol engine, I think we have to, that is the intermediate step.
This was a long discussion we had when we were negotiating the CO2 standards, because I wanted to give much more value to the battery electric rather than the plug-in hybrid. Also, because if we're speaking about reducing CO2 emissions, then a battery electric vehicle from the tailpipe has 0 emissions compared to a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. But it has to fit in within a whole framework. That's why initially I was speaking about coherent policies. And this was one of the compromises that I had to reach as well. Because unless we'll have the right amount of infrastructure charging points across the whole of the EU, you will always have a concern of range anxiety amongst people who would rather go for a plug-in hybrid rather than a battery electric vehicle. So you asked me earlier what I will be looking out for. That is another thing that I would definitely have to look out for, the policy related to alternative infrastructure across the EU.
Very good, because that's a question I have for both of you. How will you work together to ensure that we get a charging infrastructure in Europe that's sufficient?
I look forward to work with all the stakeholders, and from what I heard Eric Mark speaking today, I believe that the association wants to go forward also in this direction. So if we want to make sure that we have a successful policy related to the CO2 standards, if we want to make sure that we go in the right direction of decarbonizing road transport, then we need to make sure that we have the proper infrastructure in place, because one doesn't go without the other. In all the discussions we had, unfortunately, many times people will say, yes, but we can't move forward in having more zero emission vehicles on our roads because we don't have the infrastructure. So it was like this chicken and egg issue. The policy is there. I would like it to be more stringent, but we need to make sure that we have the infrastructure to go in that direction.
And luckily, go on.
Yeah, just a very quick answer. I fully agree with Miriam, and we need to now have mandatory targets, I think, for member states, because if the car cannot be charged, people won't buy it. We are now mandated in our sector to reduce the CO2 emission, but that won't be possible if the charging is not available. So we need mandatory targets for member states to put those chargers, even if the cars are not sold right now, they probably will be sold soon. So we are anticipating basically a big problem if the mandates and the targets of electric car charging, and also for trucks, by the way, is not mandated or even pushed by the European Union.
Perfect. I have the last question now from the audience, and this is the most rated question, so it's important. How do you plan, if any, to stop the transfer of old polluting vehicles from Western Europe to the Eastern European countries, where the power of acquisition is very low and people just want a car? Doesn't matter if this is new.
Yeah, what we do, of course, is we promote scrapping schemes. So if you trade in your car, and an example, let's say from France is, if you trade in your car and you let it get scrapped, a Euro 3 or 4 car, then you get 10,000 euro. And on top of that, you get a lot of money to buy a plug-in or an electric car. So that is the only way to remove the dirty cars from Europe. Because it's not only Eastern Europe, it's also Africa, there where dirty cars are shipped. Let's not do that anymore. Let's scrap them. So that is our solution.
This will happen if we have the right incentives, and the right incentives need to be also at the member state level. It's not only a question for the Eastern European countries. It's also, for example, a question for some of the Mediterranean countries as well. And as was mentioned also for some African countries. Because ultimately, if we are really worried about climate change, which I am, then we need to make sure that we have policies that address it also at the global level. So it has to be incentives, but it also have to be some measures at the different member state level or also at the regional level, including, for example, banning certain technology from a certain year onwards. If we want to make sure that we have new, cleaner cars coming into the market, then these kind of measures and incentives mixed together need to be in place.
Thank you. This was so interesting. We would have liked to go on forever with you two, but we're already 10 minutes past the time. And I just wanted to thank you and say that you have to keep up the good work you're doing already. A message from Norway, I wouldn't worry too much about charging infrastructure. Well, I would worry, but we have learned that the more cars you get on the road, the more private investments are done as well. And that's a good thing to think about going forward, I think.
Thank you for your participation, Miriam. Erik
Thanks
Mark.
a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Bye.
See you. Bye. Thanks a lot.
Bye.